On behalf of Eastbourne Medical Society, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. John Surtees, a retired consultant pathologist and local historian, who's going to give a talk on Dr. John Bodkin-Adams, who's quite a sort of well-known, notorious, possibly, character in Eastbourne, and well-known by a few here, I think, or known by a few here. This is, as you know, a joint meeting with Eastbourne Law Society, and it gives us great pleasure to welcome all the members of Eastbourne Law Society as well as members of Eastbourne Medical Society. And as you can see, there's been such a great interest and such a great turnout. We've come here rather than stay at Bibendum, which is a really good sign that they're really looking forward to your talk, John. So that's lovely. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to John now. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Right. Well now, I'm sorry to say that not many of you are going to enjoy this lecture. It's something which I myself and all the audience, I just have to go and get on with and do something about it. Because I'm going to start off my talk with some scandalous and scurrilous verse. So I hope you're all sitting very uncomfortably. Right. Are you ready? In Eastbourne, it is healthy, and the residents are wealthy. It's a miracle that anybody dies. Yet, this pearl of English Lido's is a slaughterhouse of widows, providing their bankrolls are above the normal size. Well now, that could be about one person and one person only, isn't it? John Bodkin-Adams. Dr. John Bodkin-Adams. And whether you knew him or your parents had him as their doctor, or you've read about him, I think most people realize that he was notorious, you might say, but certainly famous in the 1950s and up to his death in 1983. So he was a strange chappie in many ways, but I think that what I'll describe to you first is the responses I've had to talking about him. I think I've had people coming to me from certainly Australia, India, Egypt, Poland, Finland, for example, France, Germany, and obviously America and Canada and South America and South Africa and even Zimbabwe, although of course in those days it was Rhodesia. And I remember an Eastbournian who was travelling around in France at the time that Bodkin was going through his travail, and when he stopped at a petrol station to get petrol, he just happened to mention that he was from Eastbourne, and immediately the car was completely surrounded by mechanics and general factotums who wanted to know what did he think about the blue beard of Eastbourne. And but I think the most incredible story, I think, is the one about a civil engineer who lived in Eastbourne, although he wasn't in Eastbourne most of the time. But he went round the world putting up bridges and harbours and roads. And about 1980, he was sent to Albania. Now, this was before the détente and Albania was a complete fastness of a country at that time. And as was usual, when he got there, he was assigned a minder. Oh, he said, young woman with a purse string of a mouth, he said, never been outside Albania, learnt her English in the University of Tirana, and all she seemed to know about England was that they had kings and queens who exploited the workers, until he happened to say that he came from Eastbourne. When he said, her eyes lit up, a smile went from ear to ear, and she said, Eastbourne, Bodkin-Adams country. Well, you can't get much more famous than that, can you? And apart from Norman wisdom, that is. So, therefore, his trial was a quite remarkable occasion. It was, of course, at the time, the longest murder trial in the 20th century. It was the first murder trial of a doctor accused of poisoning his patient, of killing his patient in the 20th century. And I think it is still unique in that he was accused of killing a patient, murdering a patient, by furtherance of treatment. I mean, nobody suggested that Bodkin-Adams administered arsenic or pulled old lace around this old lady's necks and pulled it tight. No. What they really said was that, well, sometimes he perhaps gave a little too little of what he might be giving, and other times he gave a little bit too much of what he might have been giving. So it was a very unique occasion, and the trial had tremendous effects on many situations. It was, for example, the reason for the Criminal Justice Act of 1967, in which reporting was restricted in magistrates' courts, and there was a tremendous change in the arrangements for dangerous drugs and so on, all as a result of Bodkin-Adams. And therefore it was obvious that, it had a tremendous impact in many ways. There was also, of course, a very important aspect of the time, because when Bodkin-Adams was charged with murder in 1956, it was still 7 years before the sentence for murder of hanging by the neck was removed. So if he'd have been found guilty, he'd have been hung, as he would say himself, because he had quite a characteristic approach, very garrulous, and he would say, I remember him saying, if they find me guilty, they'll string me up by the neck like this. And he was quite a considerable champion in that way. And the other thing that appeared as a case law in the Bodkin-Adams case was that the doctrine of the double effect. This was postulated in that if a doctor decided to give a patient an injection or tablets or a powder or an enema or whatever it would be, with the aim of killing that patient, and the patient died, that was murder. But if, on the other hand, a doctor gave exactly the same dose of injection or tablets or whatever, and gave it with the aim of relieving symptoms, relieving pain, relieving distress, relieving vomiting, and the patient inadvertently died, that was not murder. And so you can see that things were getting a little bit complicated here. And of course, Bodkin was as I mentioned, a very garrulous person, and in everyday speech he would say things like, "Oh, sure, I think it was all for the best," or "her time had come," or "I like things to go easy for everybody." And, one was forced to sort of say to yourself, is he making it easy for the patient? Is he making it easy for the family? Or could he be making it easy for himself? And so we'll have to try and see a little bit about Bodkin-Adams. Here he is at the age of 57. And this is just a few little background comments on him. He was born, as you can see, in the Victorian age, and he qualified in medicine and came to Eastbourne. Now, he was of I think probably you could say, a poor family, and his father died when he was 15. He had a brother, an older brother, but he died in the 1918 influenza epidemic, and so you can imagine that Bodkin became very close to his mother. And having qualified, it was said that he was assiduous rather than brilliant at his work as an undergraduate, but he qualified finally, and his idea was to do public health, and he thought he'd get a diploma in public health and then go back to his home town and join the public health line up there. But he met a chappie who was an evangelical doctor at a meeting, and he said, well, why not come to Bristol, where I work, and we'll see what we can do for you. Well, I think he did do that and worked for his diploma in public health. But I think this Rendell Short, Professor Rendell Short, had thought at the time that he might be an ideal man for one of his evangelistic activities, but he came to the conclusion, obviously looking at Bodkin-Adams, that he wasn't really up to it. And so when a vacancy was advertised in Eastbourne for a Christian gentleman to join one of the practices, he said, you apply for that job. Well, in fact, he didn't get the job. Somebody else was appointed, but then they turned it down. And that was how he came to Eastbourne and joined the Emerson, Gurney, Rainey practice in 6 College Road. They were a very wealthy practice, and in fact the people, the doctors, were pretty wealthy themselves. One of them owned ranches in Argentina, for example, And the chappie he replaced retired to Switzerland to build a sanatoria for tuberculous nurses. So you can see that they had a very good idealistic approach to medicine. And he started off on a cycle, and this didn't please the other members of the practice. They would normally drive up in their Bentleys, and of course they felt that it was rather in for a dig for Bodkin-Adams to be turning up at the Grand Hotel, pulling his bicycle clips off, you know. So they suggested that he should get a car, whereupon Bodkin-Adams, one of his typical approaches, said, well, if you say I've got to have a car, that's fine, will you buy me one? So they decided that they weren't going to go as friendly as that. This is Six College Road where he worked, and it's still there. This is known as the Red House, or it was in those days, and there was a White House just further along the road. And before the NHS, they'd been in very great competition with each other and fought for patients and so on. And there was still, even after the NHS came in, still a bit of a contretemps between the two practices, which I think is now gone completely. I don't think that his partner, that the other members of the practice were too worried about Bodkin, because they soon realized that he wasn't really up to very much, and he wouldn't be able to get a higher qualification, which to get a partnership in the practice, you had to have a higher qualification. But in fact, old Bodkin, got at the books and spent night times reading up the material in public health, and he failed the first time, but he got an MD in public health in 1926. So now he could become a partner, and which he did. And then he bought Kent Lodge in Trinity Trees for £3,000. He bought it off a lady who lost all her money in the 1929 share crash. This is as it was up to the last about 10 years. Now it's had an extra story added on at the top here, and is essentially a block of flats. But there it was, as it was when Bodkin-Adams had it. He didn't do a thing to it, I should point out, the whole time he had it. Right. Well, then in 1934, he became a part-time anaesthetist at the Princess Alice Memorial Hospital. He hadn't any higher qualification in anaesthesia, and he had a very good reason for that, because the first qualification in anaesthesia, the DA, only came in 1935. And when Oxford University first produced the qualification. And then in 1935, he visited the Mayo Clinic in the USA. Now, if a Eastbourne doctor goes to the United States these days, well, he goes there and comes back, and that's it. But for a provincial doctor to go to America and go to the Mayo Clinic in 1935 was a quite exceptional business. And I think that, you would be entitled to say, what a chappie, obviously very interested in bettering himself and helping his patients and getting extra knowledge and all the rest of it. But even if you said to people about his visit to the Mayo Clinic, they would all say, "Oh, he never went to the." But if he went to the Mayo Clinic, he went there on a Saturday morning when they didn't open, what he went to the USA for was to have some special glasses ground by Mayo and Lom, because of course he was a great clay pigeon shooting chappie, and he wanted the best glasses for that activity. Right. Well, in 1936 he became senior partner in the practice, and he had been engaged to Miss Nora O'Hara, but it was broken off. And it's rather interesting because it was, again with Bodkin, the O'Haras were rich butchers in Eastbourne. They had about 3 or 4 shops in Eastbourne, and they were spread between Hastings and Brighton. And they bought a house for the couple in Carew Road, and then Bodkin went and broke off the engagement. It is said that Miss O'Hara's father was about to horse whip him, but never quite came to that, I don't think. But the reason always given for why he broke off the engagement was that his mother, and very typical of a middle-class person of the time, his mother said that her son, who was as a professional person, was not going to marry into trade. So there you are. So that they remained the best of friends, by the way. They used to meet once a month and have a meal together right up until the deaths. Right. And then another happening occurred. A patient, Mrs. Matilda Whitten, left him £3,000 in her will. Worth about 100,000 in today's money. And she had come from the north of England in 1930. As far as I'm aware, the family never came down to see her the whole time she was down in Eastbourne. And she became very friendly with Bodkin-Adams' mother, and she used to call Bodkin my dear Bodkin, John, my dear John. And he used to, what he would do, he would take the 2 ladies out in his car onto the downs and leave them to have a picnic there, and then after surgery he'd drive up again and pick them up and bring them back. Now you don't get that service from your GPs these days, do you? And the family of Mrs. Whitten contested the will. And Bodkin, instead, typical of him, he would say things like, "It was her last living wish that I had this money. Who am I to say I'm not going to take it," which is what she wanted. In fact, in the case, it was quite clear that it was all above board, and she'd made a proper will out, and that he was entitled not only to the 3,000 in her will, but also the residue after various other minor bequests. So he won that, but the medical fraternity in Eastbourne were absolutely shocked by this, because they thought, the thing you don't do is you don't fight with the family over a will. You have a talk to them in private and say something like, "Well, I wasn't expecting all this, and what about us sharing it 50-50 or something of those lines?" But of course that wouldn't be Bodkin's approach. But it meant that quite a few people, and many of the medical fraternity in Eastbourne, already thought, hello, we've got a bit of a lad on our hands here. I have to say, here's a picture of, there's Bodkin there, and there is Nora O'Hara there. Then he did quite well. He got a thriving private practice going until, of course, the war came. This is undoubtedly his. Oh, crumbs! They're always going forward, aren't they? That's right. There's the tower of the town hall, so it's definitely Eastbourne. And he was in a bit of trouble then, because of course all his private patients, and he got quite a good private practice by then, all his private patients moved out of Eastbourne as soon as the bombing started, because they'd probably got a castle or some other place in Scotland or something of that order. And so he lost all his private patients. And also, he was very bitter about it because there was a arrangement whereby doctors who stayed behind to look after the inhabitants of towns as Eastbourne, which was largely evacuated, of course, in the war, got an added increment, because obviously the Eastbourne population went down from about 50,000 to 10,000. And they would decide on a number of doctors who could cover this, and they decided on a number of 12. And then the amount was distributed out amongst those 12 doctors. And Bodkin-Adams was particularly annoyed because he wasn't included in the 12. So he was one of the few doctors left in Eastbourne during the 39-45 war, and he worked under difficult conditions with few, if any, private patients. He had an air raid shelter built in his house at Kent Lodge, and he evacuated his mother up to the Dicker, and otherwise just about survived, I think, in many ways financially. But he did work at it, and he took his diploma in anaesthetics, and then in 1944 his mother died. And he'd lived with her and a cousin at Kent Lodge. Well, then the war finished, and I just want to give you an example of Edith Morell in the way he developed his relationship with his patients. This is the dear lady. She lived at Marden-Ash on the Beachy Head Road, mansion, I suppose you'd call it, and she, in fact, until only a few years ago, in the specialist dahlia catalogues, there was a Edith Morell dahlia, which was obviously produced by a gardener, not by her. And she went off in 1948 to stay with her son, who was a solicitor in Cheshire, and while there, she had a stroke. And then she was moved back to an Eastbourne nursing home on the 5th of July. And the first prescription of morphine by Dr. Adams was on the 9th of July. Of course, it was obvious that it would be Dr. Adams who would be looking after her, because she was obviously very rich. She owned most of Cunard White Star Line, as an example of her money. Well, she lived in a suite in the Grand Hotel during 1948 when she came back, but then she moved back to home, and Hubert Sogno, the solicitor, was summoned by Dr. Adams to make a new will for Mrs. Morell. Mrs. Morell, I'm afraid, was one of those ladies who exert her authority in life by making new wills. She made 7 in the course of about 5 years. And in this will, Dr. Adams received a canteen of silver, and but her chauffeur got £1,000, and the nurses got £100 each. She had 24-hour nursing, of course. And just a little note there, the nurses' notebooks began on the 21st of June. And the next year, fell to Dr. Adams to tell the solicitor that Mrs. Morell wished to make a new will as I mentioned, and in this he received an additional bequest of an Elizabethan cupboard and a Rolls Royce. But the Rolls Royce was conditional to Mrs. Morell being predeceased by her son, Chappie, in Cheshire. And he was a healthy 47-year-old, so, I think it was a bit unlikely that that it would actually come to him. And then Adams goes on holiday to Scotland. He went shooting in Scotland every September. And on the 15th of September, Mrs. Morell cuts Dr. Adams out of his will, out of her will, with a codicil. You can imagine the lady, can't you? There she was, getting very attached to her dear doctor, and then he suddenly goes off and leaves her to go to shooting in Scotland. Well, she wasn't having that, so she had a codicil which cut him out of her will altogether. So, but you notice the next day, Bodkin-Adams, having heard of it, hoofs back to Eastbourne as quickly as possible and had a chat to her, and Mrs. Morell finally tore up the codicil on the 23rd of October, and he finally returned on the 24th of September, and Mrs. Morell died on the 13th of November at the age of 81. Now, of course, these days 81 is young, but then it was quite a good age. And also, as doctors in the audience will know, she'd now been almost 3 years after a severe stroke, so she'd really done quite well there. Right, well, now we leave Mrs. Morell having demonstrated the closeness he could have with some of his patients, and we move a little bit further away from Meads towards the coast, and this is the house that we're concerned about here, which is now part of Bede's School. Holywell Mount it was, and there lived a chappie called Jack Hullett, who was he was one of the sort of big chappie in the city, and he was now retired, and who should be, as he was very rich and had a lovely house there, who should be his doctor but Bodkin-Adams, of course. And this was the setup there. This was this is Jack Hullett, who was the chappie. This is his wife, Gertrude, but always known as Bobby. And, of course, who was his doctor in Eastbourne, of course, as he was rich? Bodkin-Adams, who is here taking a photograph of him. There's this. And this is at a Concours d'Elegance in Eastbourne in 1954 for Rolls Royces, and Jack Hullett had a Rolls Royce there. And then in the November of the next year, 55, Jack Hullett complained of some bowel symptoms, and Dr. Adams diagnosed cancer of the bowel in Jack Hullett, and he consulted with top surgeon Sir Arthur Porritt, who was later Governor General of New Zealand. I knew, in fact, better do a bit of name dropping, hadn't I? I knew Sir Arthur Porritt quite well. Very nice chap. And Sir Arthur Porritt operated on Mr. Hullett at the Esperance and nursing home. And unfortunately, Mr. Hullett died on the 14th of March, leaving £500 in his will to Dr. Adams. Mrs. Hullett, Bobby, was very depressed. I should point out that this was a second marriage for both of them, and she had been married previously to Tomlinson, who was one of the founders of St. Bede's, now known as Bede's, of course, and one of the teachers there. And he dropped down dead in the street, aged 48, with a heart attack. And it was only after, and then Jack Hullett's first wife died, and then Mrs. Bobby Hullett and Jack Hullett got together and were married after a cruise to the Caribbean. Well, Mrs. Hullett was very depressed. Bodkin-Adams put her on what really was the only thing they had in those days, barbiturates. And on the 14th of July, made out a will leaving her Rolls Royce to Dr. Adams, saying that her husband would have wanted her to do so. So he's getting a collection of Rolls Royces going nicely at the moment. And then she gave a £1,000 cheque to Dr. Adams, and on the 18th of July, Dr. Adams presented to his bank this cheque and asked the clerk to expedite its clearance, which is always a bit suspicious. And then Mrs. Hullett was found unconscious at her home at Holywell Mount, and Bodkin-Adams, again, an example of how he, the relationships he had with his patients, he moved into the house, had a bedroom put aside for him in the house, and proceeded to treat Mrs. Hullett to the best of his ability. He couldn't believe that she had taken a barbiturate overdosage because he'd only doled out to her 1 tablet a day. But in fact, and of course we found out later, that Mrs. Hullett saved them up and then did take them, and she died of barbiturate overdose on the Monday. Right, well, I thought we'd have another little rhyme here, a little verse. If they're lucky in addition in their choice of a physician, and remember him when making out their wills, and bequeath their Rolls Royces, then they soon hear angel voices, and are quickly freed from all their earthly ills. Well, you can understand. Wonderful doctor, isn't it, really, if you have to do that. And this is Gertrude Bobby Hullett. Now, there was a big difference about Gertrude Bobby Hullett and all the other patients that Bodkin-Adams looked after. Firstly, she was only 50. Secondly, she had many friends, not only in Eastbourne, but she was Leslie Henson, who was a top comedian of the day, was a great friend of hers, and the Bishop of Lewis and so on. And these factors combined, people said, good Lord, only 50, and I know her. No, none of us are safe now. It was all right while I knocked off 89-year-olds or something like that. But once you started doing this, people started getting worried, and so there was quite a bit of an outcry about her death. Bodkin was a bit unfortunate, really, because Hanscom, her executor, went through her details, her papers, the next day after her death, and found a suicide note. But Bodkin-Adams had said to him that it was probably a stroke, and he thought, well, because in those days particularly, it still is really to some extent, suicide had quite a stigma to it, and so Hanscom just put the note in his pocket and didn't mention anything about it at all. And also, the chief constable at the time was a chap called Richard Walker, and he was a very, very capable fellow, And for example, if you go drive around Eastbourne and lots of other towns now, and you come to a junction, you will see dot, dot, dot of double white lines. And if that's against you, then the road that you're entering is a main road and you have to watch out. Whereas if they're along the side there, you're free to go along. And it was a very good idea. It stopped a lot of people humming and hawing as to who had the right. And it's been more or less incorporated all over the country. So Walker was quite a capable chief constable of Eastbourne. What he wasn't was up to the reporters of the press, and he decided, after having had a few examples of this, to bring in Scotland Yard. And at the inquest, by which time, of course, Hanscom realised that he had to show the suicide note, and there was no doubt that Bobby Hollett had committed suicide. Both her husbands dying in a very short time, I think, had turned her mind. And so the verdict was suicide without any problem. But by that time, Walker had called in Scotland Yard. Now, of course, as soon as people hear that Scotland Yard has been called in, what do they think? Murder. And of course that got everybody excited. And Superintendent Herbert Hannon of Scotland Yard came to the inquest just as an observer, but the coroner, who was a really quite an irascible chappie, but he did know that there'd been a lot of talking about Bodkin-Adams and what he was getting up to and so on. And he thought that he would let people know that something was being done about it. And his way of doing it was to say that there had been an extraordinary amount of carelessness in Bodkin-Adams' dealings, and then called Superintendent Herbert Hannon from the well of the court into the witness box and asked him whether he had been assigned to the investigation. And Hannon said yes, and that was about all he said at that time and all there was need to. But the inquest sent the town and most of the national press absolutely buzzing on rumours of mass poisonings and murders, and we soon had lots of various ways of approaching it, which I think says quite a lot of human nature, these headlines. First of all, the Daily Sketch here. Was the £1,000 widow murdered? Well, there's nothing wrong with that, really, is there? You know, she did give him a £1,000 cheque. He did ask for it to be expedited so that it was rushed through before she died. So, you know, you couldn't complain about that at all. But the Daily Mirror said deaths of 4 women are being probed. You know, well, I don't think at that stage there was any real idea of anything at all about that. And then the Daily Mail, inquiry into 400 wills, rich women reported to have been the victims. Now, one thing I want to draw to your attention, you can still go out and buy a Daily Mirror, you can still go out and buy a Daily Mail, but the one that's gone to the wall is the Daily Sketch, which is the only one that had a true account of what had actually happened. And then there were books on it, and some did think Bodkin-Adams was innocent, but this is Herbert Hannon here, known as the Count, from his snappy clothes, and that's Brinley Pugh, who was the local CID man. And they're walking around in a cemetery because they got down to exhuming some bodies. He was a very he could deal with the press all right without any difficulty. But the main thing about Herbert Hannon was that he was straight, and this was at a time when in the Met there was a lot of bent policemen, and so that about one thing you could say about him is that he wasn't involved in anything like that. This is part of this is from a Munich paper showing, and you don't need to read German, do you? It's got Eastbourne, Dr. Adams, Scotland Yard. It's all there, isn't it? Really, and that particular journal had four issues full of Bodkin-Adams. Right, this is Mrs. Julia Bradnam. She was one of those who was exhumed. So here we are. We have another one which is, as we witness the deceased home from the stately homes of Eastbourne, we are calm, for it may safely be assumed that each lady that we bury in the local cemetery will resurface when the body is exhumed. Quite obvious, that, isn't it? It's quite simple, yes. Right, well then, what happened then? Well, Bodkin-Adams just carried on quite normally. It didn't bother him in the slightest. And on the 24th of November, the police searched Kent Lodge looking for dangerous drugs. Incredible, Bodkin, really. He was present when they were doing this. They only wanted to look at his drug cupboards. And while he had two of them, and while they were looking at one, he put his hand in his pocket and sneaked to the other one and pushed in a parcel. And the parcel had 2 vials of morphine in it. There was no other morphine in the house. And yet when the police said to him, "What are you doing? What have you been doing?" He said, "Nothing, I haven't done anything at all." "What did you put in your dangerous drugs cupboard?" And he said, "Nothing." But of course they said, "Of course you did." And you couldn't imagine anything more likely to make the police suspicious about what was goings on. But the next day, Victor James, Dr. Adams's solicitor, looked round the place to see whether he could find anything, and he found a parcel containing 8 books of notes behind a filing cabinet. What had happened is that after the death of one of his patients, these notes, nurses' notes, had been given to Bodkin-Adams, and he didn't know what on earth to do with them. So he put them on top of a filing cabinet, and over the years they dropped down to the back, and Bodkin didn't know anything about them at all, but Victor James did hunt them out. Just as a matter of interest for the solicitors, Victor James, as I say, Dr. Adams' sister, was a great supporter of Bodkin-Adams. He really was. And in my experience and in others, there were only about 2 solicitors in the town who thought that Bodkin was anywhere near innocent. Right, this is his one of his poison cupboards. It was an absolute, as you can see, everything all hiddledy-piddledy, and there were boxes of butter and sugar and all the rest, along with these dangerous drugs, and that was Bodkin-Adams, I'm afraid, and so this is one of the poisons book. This, of course, was before some of the Dangerous Drugs Act, and all you had to do was the pharmacist just had to say who had prescribed the drugs, but nobody had to say what they'd actually had, what they'd actually given to the patients. But you can see here Omnipon, which is an oral morphine. Right. Well, then he in the 26th of November he appeared in court on 13 charges. He was charged under the Forgery Act for transgressions of National Health Service regulations. Typical of Bodkin. If a patient came to him as a private patient, being dissatisfied with what their GP was doing for them, he would see them, would charge them, but would say, "Don't worry, we'll get your tablets on the NHS." And he would prescribe, and quite simple, that's just aspirin, phenasterine, and codeine tablets, pain relievers. And he prescribed these tablets on another doctor's prescription slip, and then put PP and sign his name underneath it. As far as he was concerned, as long as he put PP, that was all right. But of course it did mean that the NHS paid for those, even though the doctor didn't know that he'd prescribed them. And then there were also 4 more serious charges of making false statements under the Cremation Act. Well, this is that, as every doctor will know, in the cremation form it says, "Do you have any pecuniary advantage from this death?" And, I knew a doctor who was the medical referee at Brighton, and he'd been the medical referee there for 50 years, and I asked him about this, and he said he had never seen a doctor say yes in the whole of those 50 years. So, it would be very strange indeed, because you're saying that you don't know anything about any pecuniary advantage, which you don't know in the week or 2 after the death. And the only way you would know is when the will comes out, and you would then receive the money. Well, that could be 6 months. I mean, Bodkin said, they don't surely expect me to wait, put the body in a fridge and keep it there for 6 months until the will was proved, and only then would I know for sure that I wasn't going to get any benefit from the death. So I think it was a rather artificial approach, at any rate. Bodkin got bail for that, at any rate. But on December the 20th, he was charged with a further 3 offences under the Dangerous Drugs Act and with the murder of Mrs. Morell. And he was remanded in custody. He was in custody for over Christmas for that time. And this is the magistrate. This is outside the town hall, as you can see. And this is when the magistrate's court heard the supposition that Bodkin should be charged with murder. It was all slightly complicated because the chappie who was the chairman of the bench, Roland Gwynn, he was a great pal of Bodkin-Adams, and so he couldn't be chairman. And so they appointed a chappie who was a publican in the town, and he was honest and that sort of thing, but he had no idea really of how to control the councils who were trying to get as much in against Bodkin as they possibly could. But this is the queues. The queues were there all the time, and if somebody couldn't get in because they closed the doors, and in fact on the first day 2 women were taken out by handing over. They'd fainted with the heat and the crush and so on, and they had to be taken out. And when they closed the doors for the people going, they all went back and started queuing for the afternoon session again. So it was really quite a popular thing for in Eastbourne. But I mean, there was nothing really. They if they'd have not committed him, they would have been considered that there was a bit of fiddle going on in Eastbourne. Although I think that the way that the prosecuting counsel were allowed freedom to bring in other cases and all the rest of it during the magistrates' court was quite unreasonable. Of course, when it was at the Old Bailey, they weren't allowed to do that. So there's he's now committed on a charge of murder, and the sentence for murder was still hanging at that time, and the trial began on the 18th of March. This was 400 people wrote to him when he was in Brixton prison, wishing him goodwill, and this is one of his replies: "Thank you very much for your letter and birthday greetings, and I think that things will go all right," type of thing. He was quite convinced he was innocent and would get off, and in fact, just before before the trial started, he rang Clark and Lambert, who were one of the garage people at the time, and said would they respray one of his cars so that he would look good as he came out of court, a free man. Right. Well, the judge was Lord Devlin, a very clever chappie, and I think theoretically he gave a very good summing up, and was really, I think, there was no doubt that he was quite capable. And then, if you're looking for a hero of the trial, it's Geoffrey Lawrence, who was Hempson's, were the solicitors for the Medical Defence Union, and they brought in Geoffrey Lawrence, which was very interesting, really. I don't know quite why. Because I don't know whether they'd had their eyes on him and thought he's just the man who's got the ability to turn this case round. Because that time, of course, everybody thought Bodkin would definitely get away with it. But the only thing is that this was his first criminal case. He'd spent his whole legal life, in fact, supporting or opposing various local authorities in their interminable arguments about drainage and boundaries and all the rest of it. So it was quite remarkable that they chose him. But if anybody was the hero of the trial, it was Geoffrey Lawrence. Right, well, no, these aren't the three witches of Macbeth. These are 3 of the nurses who were, as they say, they're Randall, Stronach and Mason Ellis. And these were 3 of the nurses who were part of the team who provided 24-hour cover for Mrs. Morell. Brenda Bartlett was the other one. And essentially, what the nurses were, the first day of the trial was just proving the validity of various prescriptions and things like that. And then the second day of the trial, the prosecuting counsel asking the nurses about it, and essentially got from them that, that Dr. Adams prescribed or gave morphine even when the patient was in coma. And of course, the only conclusion of that could be that he was decided to murder them. And then Geoffrey Lawrence's turn came to cross-examine this nurse and said, if only we had your nursing reports, we could see exactly what happened. But in fact, of course, these pile of ordinary ruled soft-backed exercise books, which had fallen behind the filing cabinet at Kent Lodge, turned out to be the nursing reports for the Mrs. Morell case, which the prosecution had not seen. And he said, if only we had the reports, and to which the nurse replied, yes, but you have my word for it. Whereupon, and it is said in one of the most dramatic moments in the Old Bailey, Lawrence bent down, brought up the soft-backed, ruled exercise book, opened it up and said, is that your night report for the 4th of June 1950? As a trained nurse, you would not have made, omitted any record. On the day you say she was semi-conscious and rambling, your report states breakfast, boiled egg, bread and butter, bramble jelly, 2 cups of tea, and lunch, partridge, celery, pudding, brandy and soda. Does that fit in with your statement? And the nurse said, oh, she would only have had very small portions. And Mr. Lawrence said, I'm not suggesting he had a banquet, but do you suggest that is the behaviour of a semi-conscious woman? And the nurse, who'd been in the witness box all day, then said her most sensible words, namely, I have nothing to say. It is said that the word partridge had more effect on the jury than all the expert witnesses in the case. Right, then on the third day, I should point out that the nurses in the first few days travelled up and down from Eastbourne to London together and chatted about the case. And one of the commuters on this occasion, on the third day, had heard them talking and had heard one of the nurses say to another one, don't say that or you'll get me into trouble. And he'd rung Mr. Lawrence's office at the Old Bailey and said, A, the nurses are committing an offence by talking about it because one of the nurses had given evidence, one of the other ones was in the witness box, and another one was still to give evidence, so they should never have been meeting up and discussing the case. So when he said, did anybody say, don't say that, you'll get me into trouble, she replied, I can't remember. And Lawrence said, I'm not now asking you to remember what happened 6 years ago. I'm asking you to remember something which happened on the train this morning. And really, he, completely reduced the nurse's evidence to worthlessness. what they were discussing was that one of the nurses had said when that she'd been asked about the keys and the dangerous drugs that they'd got there, that they'd always locked up the cupboard before they went and all the rest of it. And one of the nurses who hadn't given evidence said, you know, if I'm asked specifically about that, I'll have to say that there were times, do you remember when, you know, one of us might have been a bit late and that sort of thing, when we just left the keys and went off, and the other one would take over. And that was when the other one said, don't say that or you'll get me into trouble. And he got them all into trouble, I think. Right. And then one of the things that the nurses were saying is that Dr. Bodkin-Adams would come in, and even though the patient was sleepy or something like that, he would give them a big syringe full of morphine. Well, of course, it was found by looking at the nurses' notebooks that in fact it wasn't morphine. They got it all wrong over 6 years of thinking about it, and it was a substance, and it was and it was a substance called formaldehyde, which every doctor knows that it's a very mild sedative. You more or less have to drown it in it to kill you. It had a great disadvantage, of course. It had a terrible smell, and the patient had a terrible smell as well. Right. Well, then on the sixth day, Mr. Long solicited from Hubert Sogno, the solicitor, that Mrs. Morell's will Dr. Adams didn't benefit from Mrs. Morell's will, because just tearing up the codicil wasn't sufficient, because of course the solicitor also would have a copy of that will, and therefore the codicil would still apply. So in fact, therefore, Dr. Bodkin-Adams didn't, in this instance, benefit at all from it. And then they brought in, having had the nurses discredited, they brought in the doctors, and Arthur Doothwaite, who was the Guy's Hospital physician, said it was wrong. You can almost imagine his wattles going, wrong, you know, wrong in all circumstances to give morphine to a patient after a stroke. And Geoffrey Lawrence, who had been more assiduous looking at all the various happenings, found that when Mrs. Morell had her stroke at her son's house in Cheshire, she had been moved to Neston Nursing Home. And in Neston Nursing Home, they couldn't get her to have a good night's sleep, so they'd started her off on morphine. And so therefore, Geoffrey Lawrence pointed out that other doctors use morphine in such situations. And Dr. Doothwaite maintained that his condemnation was complete. And it is said that a titter ran round the court as he said this, because obviously it was quite ridiculous. This is Michael Ashby, who was one of the other doctors. Now, Michael Ashby just said what was found and what wasn't found, and he said what was found was that the prescription, Bodkin had prescribed a tremendous amount of morphine for Mrs. Morell. And in fact, in looking through the various pharmacies around the town, you can't get them all and know exactly which ones he went to. But he roughly, as far as I could see, prescribed about 6 times as much morphine than the average general practitioner at the time. And that is the important thing, really, because I was in practice then. And the doctors were absolutely scared stiff of creating addicts. This is what they wouldn't do. And they would, if the patient was in pain, they would say something like, a sixth of a grain of morphine, that's 10 milligrams, TDS 3 times a day. Well, if that patient's pain came on after 4 hours of the injection, that meant they were in pain for half the day. But of course it was very easy to assess just exactly what use had been made of the morphine when you checked it out once a week. And all Michael Ashby said was that the amounts prescribed were out of the ordinary, but he had no proof that they had actually been given. Whereas Arthur Doothwaite, who was a much senior chappie to him, came along with the idea that what Bodkin was doing was he was reducing the amount of morphine for a certain length of time and then suddenly bumping it up again so that the patient would no longer be resistant to the morphine and would die. Nobody knows quite why Doothwaite was saying this. Some people say that he did a bit of general practice when he was younger, and he met a doctor a bit like Bodkin-Adams, and he was determined to get rid of Bodkin-Adams and not have him treating patients. But he then admitted that his theory about Dr. Adams was only thought up in the witness box on the 10th day of the trial. And of course you can obviously change your mind in the light of evidence that is disclosed, but you can't suddenly come up with new theories in the middle of a trial. So the doctors really have been proven to be a bit of a waste of time there. And this is Reginald Manningham Buller, who was the Attorney General at the time, known as Bullying Manor, from the way he treated the witnesses. And he was a strange chap in many ways, really, but he was essentially a politician. He was the Attorney General at the time, and therefore I think took the case on as he thought an open and shut case, and which would help his career. In fact, his career wasn't hindered at all because he became Lord Chancellor a few years later. And he said, we'll just go back for another one. He said that he wasn't too worried about the nurses being discredited and the doctors being a bit of a waste of time, because when he got Bodkin-Adams in the witness box, he'd break and overflow like a lightly boiled egg, was his expression. And then, of course, our dear Mr. Loms announced that Dr. Adams would not be giving evidence which halted the Attorney General's avowed intent of leading Dr. Adams into convicting himself by his excessive talking about it. I don't think there's any doubt that Bodkin would have convicted himself, because he was a very garrulous individual. And the Attorney General That's right. Yes, I mentioned that already. Right. Good. And the defence even managed to find a Dr. John Hannam, who expressed the opinion that Miss Abrell had in fact died from stroke and not a medication. And as I mentioned, she'd had a pretty good time after a stroke, and it wasn't an unreasonable thing to mention. Dr. Harman, and then there was also the Attorney General Manningham Buller. I think they must have had a little session together sometime, because not the first woman head of MI5, but one of the heads of MI5 in the last few years was Rachel Manningham Buller, who was the daughter of Manningham Buller, and who is the deputy of the Labour Party in the House of Commons, Harriet Harman, who was the daughter of John Harman, who was there. So they obviously got themselves going. Right, and in the summing up, the judge said the case for the defence seems to me a strong one. And the jury, after retiring for only 44 minutes, recorded a no, not guilty verdict. Well, I mean, that to me is a terribly short time to discuss it. In my experience, and I'm sure there are many here more experienced than me, but most juries haven't even decided their sitting order after 45 minutes, never mind can't come to a conclusion. So it was really quite, and as I mentioned before, they'd said that the Partridge had given them more help than anything else. Here's Bodkin reading about his case. And then in the July, he was then up on the various other offences, the cremations and the dangerous drugs and so on. And he was fined £2,000, and his ability to prescribe dangerous drugs was withdrawn, and then later on he was struck off the medical register. I think it was a bit like getting somebody because your near back light isn't working or something like that. But there you are. That's it. Right, well, he was returned to the medical register 4 years later and recommenced practice, although he was never able to prescribe dangerous drugs. And in 1983, he was a meeting of the Hastings Clay Pigeon Shooting Club when he fell down some steps and broke his hip. And we actually have present in our midst today the chap who knocked him off. Right, farewell to Dr. Bodkin-Adams. He left 402,000, I think it was, which is quite a considerable sum in those days, being certainly in the millions these days. And then I just go through a few of these things. In the opinion of professional legal staff in Eastbourne, they said that the prosecution took the wrong case. Well, Lord Devlin, in his book, because the judge went on incredibly to write a book on his own, on a case that he had presided over. But I think, as far as I'm aware, the only judge ever to do that. But he went through all the cases and all the other patients and said that the Hullet one, he was charged with the Hullet ones, but they never proceeded with those. But the Morell case was the strongest case there was. And if you ask a legal person in the town, for example, they don't generally have much idea of who might be a better case to go by. Then a close friend of a relative said that he had no doubt he'd killed his ladies for money. He wanted to be secure. There's no doubt, I think, that he was poor upbringing, and then during the war he knew what it was not to have too much money, and he was determined that wasn't going to happen again. And Gordon Clark, the captain's mechanic who serviced his cars, said, he was a funny chap. Personally, I think he did kill them, but not in a deliberate way, He helped them over. And therefore we can have another of these. It's the mortuary chapel, if they touch an Adam's apple, and after parting with the Bentley as a fee. So to liquidate your old kin, just by the needle or the bodkin, just bring them down to sunny Eastbourne by the sea. And the matron of Prince Alice Hospital, she was Mr. Pinto. She's by far the best matron I ever came across. So her opinion was well worth having, and she said that never a murderer, a sort of a friendly man who acted in a naive way. And there we are. This is Matron de Pinto. That's a chap called McQueen, who was the doctor. It's one of the surgeons who was the chairman of the Princess Alice Hospital, and that's Glegg, who was the secretary. And one of the local GPs said, Bodkin was a greedy man, a collector of trinkets, money and cars. I think he had the ability to be a good doctor, but his patients asked to be fussed, and they wanted his time and immediate availability. It is said, of course, that if at 2 o'clock in the morning you rang Bodkin and asked him to come out to see you, before you could put the telephone back in its cradle, his Bentley or Rolls would be driving up the gravel of your entrance path. So, and he certainly did. There's no doubt he would turn out at any time of day and night. He had 800 NHS patients, and there wasn't I interviewed a number of them, and they were extolled his service and said that he looked after them as well as anybody else. They couldn't have been looked after better. And this little thing, on his 5th birthday, our son wasn't well, and we had to call Dr. Adams, who said it was measles, so we had to cancel the birthday party. And later that day, there was a ring at the door, and he was standing there, and he handed in a model Lagonda, and said this might make up for his disappointment. So there was kindly touches to him. And Vincent Harris, who was a partner of the 6 College Road at the time, said he had a very kind and caring side of his nature, particularly to many of his poorer patients. Dr. Shearer, one of the pathologists at the time, was quite convinced that he was a murderer. But unfortunately, of course, when you go into it, there's more to it. He used to, before the NHS, before antibiotics really, he used to produce vaccines. And if you had a boil or some other thing like that, he would, the doctor, GP would ask him to prescribe a vaccine, which he would make up from the swab that he would take, and he would charge half a guinea for that. And Bodkin never paid him never paid him anything about that, and so he was, he didn't. There's a little feeling there, I should think, and so can't just think that Shearer was there. Then Bodkin-Adams, Basil Barker said that Bodkin was a fool and a greedy fool, but he was never a murderer. And he had, of course, Bodkin had all the hotels signed up, and most of the companies as well. He was very, very, very involved, certainly, with them. And this is one of the directors saying that they looked after the staff wonderfully, and never had a bad word about him. He looked after the men splendidly. So there you are. There was one. There was one person who wouldn't have him, and that is a lady who ran a women's catering college, Rannies, and she said she would never have a man who had fingers like sausages handling her gals. So, but otherwise, they all thought he was wonderful. Right. And Phyllis Turner, who was his main district nurse, said that he thought she was kind and gentle. And local pharmacist, Michael Clark, said that he was foolishly greedy, but not a murderer. In many respects, he was naive, and he should have been struck off because of the way he handled his dangerous drugs. And I think there's some merit in that, yes. And this is Dr. Barkworth again. And he said, in character, he had a lot in common with Toad of Toad Hall. He was incapable of feeling that anything he thought essential might possibly be outside the law. Yes, I'll go back from that for a moment. You know, no matter what happens in life, there's always someone who benefits from whatever disasters afflict everybody else. And all the newspapers wanted the death certificates of all these 400 people who were said to have been Dr. Adams's victims. And it wasn't enough for the Daily Sketch to get them out and then hand them out to the mail and so on. No, every newspaper had to have their copies of the death certificates of these 400 people. It is said that it was the only time that the Eastbourne Registrar of Births, Marriages and Deaths actually showed a profit in the whole time. So, there you are. John Bodkin-Adams. What do you think?